Okay, welcome back everybody to another webinar organized by Princeton for everyone worldwide. We're very happy to have Larry Summers with us, former Treasury Secretary, Chief Economist of the World Bank, and many other official positions. He's one of the big thinkers of our times, and he will rethink multilateralism. And he raised this issue in a group of 30 meetings in October, outlining new thoughts, how we should think about the international global arrangements we have. And before we go to Larry, let me just give a few opening remarks, and then we will discuss with Larry his vision, how the international governance should look like. Of course, you can have an institution-based or rule-based organization, or very much an outcome-based, or you can, have more multilateralism or bilateralism. But if you focus on the institutions, what we have at the moment, essentially, you have the United Nations, WHO, IMF, World Bank, and others, all governed now together somehow with the G20 playing some superstructure on it. So we have to think about how to structure the voting rights. So we have different institutions. Some institutions is one country, one vote. Others have much more shareholder arrangement. And this leads to different outcomes and different efficiency in interacting the things. And then we have a global international financial institutions and regional, and there's an interaction between the two, and how should this be coordinated between the regional agencies and the global ones. So that's many things one has to rethink about. And there's a shift in focus, and that's very much based on a report Larry wrote with others for the G20, where right now we are very much focused on lending. It's a lending-based model in order to build new infrastructure in certain developing countries, to reconstruction coming from after the Second World War, to restructure, reconstruct essentially Europe and the developing countries. That's the World Bank. And then we have the IMF doing solving liquidity problems. But probably we should shift much more to a provision of public goods and mitigating risks coming out, fostering resiliency, and is a much more global focus rather than infrastructure or liquidity crisis focused. And what the one prime public good is, of course, health. And the question is, how should we finance this? Should we give some long-term financing? How should be the emergency financing and so forth? So what type of financing do we need for these public goods? Of course, there are more public goods besides global health. There's cybersecurity. There will be, with artificial intelligence, brain-computer interfaces, some genetics. There might be some mishaps, so we need some common standards for that, and we probably need some thinking along these lines as well. We have natural disasters, just think of tsunamis, and we need some information sharing. And as we saw with a recent variant of the virus, South Africa was very forthcoming about sharing the information, but essentially it's punished immediately afterwards. So we have to have some compensation for if you're very forthcoming with information, which is part of a public good to share the information. And how you fund and how to provide the public good, there are different ways to think about it, and the different goods are acting differently. So traditionally, we think how to provide a public good, everybody is chipping in, and then the sum of the efforts and the inputs every country does provides essentially then the public good. And because it's a public good, there's all these positive externalities, there's a free rider problem. And especially smaller nations have an incentive to free ride. The hegemon or the big country has less of an incentive because it's the big country. But there are also other public goods where it's the weakest link or the best shot. And that's a terminology I took from Jack Hirschleifer, an early paper, where essentially it's what is the weakest link philosophy is that what the weakest or the lowest effort is, that's what the extent of the public good is. So there's less free riding, of course, because even a single country, a small country, says if I don't provide much of a public good, then the total public good provision will be very small. So you can think of vaccine distribution. So if you're very bad in vaccine distribution, it actually, the virus will come back in different mutations and so forth, different variants will come back. So it's a weakest link public good. But on the other hand, if you think about best shot public good, it's actually what the best input is. And that's if you do vaccine development. It's like if one country does a fantastic vaccine development, others will benefit from it. So it's the best shot. And of course, in the best shot, there's the largest free rider problem. Weakest link, there's much lesser free riding problem. In the best shot, there's a much larger free riding problem. So the question is, should we have some vaccine patterns and how to incentivize large countries or some countries to provide this public good very efficiently. So that's essentially about provision of the public good, how to implement it. There's all the different thinkings, like with clubs. We have this climate clubs we're talking about. Bill Nordhaus was talking about this. We have in debt restructuring, we have the Paris Club. But now we move to a new common framework because there are too many players essentially involved these days. And then can we have different clubs for different public goods? How do they overlap? And how do we think about these circles and sub-clubs? How do we rearrange them? That's another way to structure the provision of the public goods. And then there's another challenge. Another challenge is that different players of different countries have different values. They have different ethical focus. In the Western world, we focus very much on individuals. Others focus perhaps much more on group, on nationwide thinking. Privacy plays a huge role. So data protection and no surveillance is very, very important, good for some parts of the world. Other parts is less important. The different risk attitudes and how to bring this together under one roof, these are all big challenges. And finally, let me just say a few words about unipolar versus bipolar world. Is it the case that there is more provision of public goods if there's a competition between two hegemons like China and the US? Like we have seen in the Marshall Plan, it was extremely generous, but it might have played also a role that you wanted limited influence of communism in Europe or expansion of communism in Europe. In the Cold War, there was huge development aid, and was the bipolar world helping in terms of providing more public good? And there's competition between two polars. And of course, today the US is challenged militarily, but also economically from China. And Larry raised the issue, I raised this last time also, the balance of financial terror. Perhaps is this still relevant in today's world or not? And what role do trade agreements play in this whole thing, in particular in the context of standard setting? And one final thing I would like to throw at Larry as well is co-opetition. The Biden administration tries to cooperate in some areas and compete in other areas. And is this feasible or not? How do we create this competition? And if we cooperate in some areas, which areas we bundle together and cooperate together, and which areas we compete on? How do we disentangle the two things? And does this best shot or this weak link public good provision play a role in this distinction, which areas we bundle together and say, okay, for these we cooperate in a bundle, and the others we separate and cooperate in different degrees or even compete with each other? So with this opening questions, I'm throwing everything at Larry, knowing his wealth of knowledge in this area and his expertise and in international trade negotiations or in any international arena. We're looking forward to Larry's speech, and then we will interject with questions in the middle. Thanks a lot, Larry, for being with us, and we're looking forward to it.
Markus, thank you. Thank you very much. Much of our discussion is about public good provision, and you have provided an important public good to the economics profession and to the broader world by hosting these seminars. And I'm glad to have an opportunity to return to this important forum. I'm not, and thank you for your kind words about me. There's a lesson one learns when one works in Washington, which is the importance of managing expectations and managing them downwards so that you can surprise positively. You have made that essentially impossible with those kind concluding words about me. And you have raised enough topics that I could talk for hours, but you have informed me that you want me to speak only very briefly. So let me make these remarks, if I could, and then we can take the conversation wherever it wants to go. It's kind of a cliche to say that the Bretton Woods system should be reinvented. One can look at every year divisible by 5 since Bretton Woods and find much discussion of the need to reinvent the Bretton Woods system. I am increasingly convinced that this is actually a moment when, in important respects, the Bretton Woods system does need to be reinvented. And that is a reflection, in my view, of three realities of this moment. First, the principal security threats that we face now have as much to do with nations' capacity to mobilize cooperation on global issues as they do with nations' capacities to deter and inhibit aggression by other nations. To see that as an American, all you need to know is that in 3 months, it will be the case that twice as many people died of COVID as died in all the wars the United States participated in after the Civil War. One needs to contemplate climate change. One needs to contemplate pandemic, where, in my view, the really scary thing about Omicron is not the damage Omicron is going to do, bad as it is, but its demonstration that much larger mutation is possible than we had previously envisioned. That's in line with a trend towards COVID-type events, nearly doubling in frequency every 15 years over the last half century. One might also add to your list of global public goods the broad moral development challenge associated with what is happening on the African continent, which will represent nearly half the world's population by the end of this century. So the first imperative is the fact that global security depends upon managing global cooperation in the commitment and application of resources. The second is less certain, but I think has a substantial chance of being the case. And that is that the fact that for a long time now, markets have been telling us that the real interest rate a decade from now, on average, in the industrial world or in the emerging world on safe assets is going to be negative, is telling us something quite profound about there being an abundance of global saving relative to the availability of financeable, high return, high risk adjusted return, private return projects. It is not telling us that there are not such projects available. It is not telling us that there are not investments with a very high social return available, but it is telling us that our capital markets as they function today are faced with an abundance of funds supplied relative to funds that can be demanded on an attractive risk-adjusted return basis. That calls for substantial strengthening of financial intermediation, broadly understood to permit both the more successful funding of high return projects that currently cannot be funded and projects that have low private return but high social return. Surely the most important aspect of that problem involves the level of what used to be called north-south capital flows at a time when a disproportionate share of the world's population growth, more than 100%, is going to be taking place in the developing world. Anyone trained in economics on Mars who came to study planet Earth would expect that there would be large continuing flows from the aging, slowly growing global north to the much broader global south. These two imperatives suggest to me a need for a rethinking, replenishing, and reinventing of the international global financial architecture and the development banking system in particular. The traditional mission of the development banking system has been the transfer of resources in a foreign aid model. The efficacy of those transfers has over time been a matter of continuing debate and question. I have long been concerned about issues of fungibility. I remember as I was moving in to succeed Stan Fisher 30 years ago as the chief economist of the World Bank, I said to Stan, how does the World Bank know that when it funds a health project or a bridge in a developing country, that that's what it's really funding, or whether the institution, whether the country put forward its best project for the World Bank, and in fact, what's being funded is a marginal bit of the government budget. And Stan thought for a minute and said, you know, when I got here, I talked about fungibility all the time. And then I just kind of stopped talking about fungibility. Not exactly because I was convinced that that was not an issue, but because I just stopped talking about it. And I think there is a real tendency in that direction with respect to the traditional provision of foreign assistance through traditional modes. On the other hand, we lack satisfactory financial instruments for responding to periodic global emergencies in the development banking system. I remember during the Asian financial crisis, when there were desperate liquidity shortages on the part of many developing countries, at the US Treasury pushing the World Bank to provide large-scale lending to support immediate social spending operations. And Jim Wolfenson saying to me, Larry, goddammit, we are not going to be a money pump for the IMF and the US Treasury. We are only here to fund longer-term structural reforms. And yet at moments like COVID, the necessity is what it is. It is clear that at this point, the world has a zero chance of meeting a 2-degree target, let alone a 1.5-degree target, without massive financing of an energy transformation, much of which is going to take place in the private sector. And yet the development banks have multiple instruments, co-financing, MEGA, private sector arms, that act in whatever the opposite of unison is, disunison, I guess you could say, at very low levels of aggregate financing. It is clear that new approaches are going to be needed if we are to succeed in mobilizing resources on an adequate scale. So there's a need for a reinvention of instruments. I believe of finding ways to directly fund global public goods, and also of exploiting the unique capacities of international financial institutions to generate resources that can be reallocated to global public goods. One of the key attributes that international financial institutions have, to slip into theorists' jargon for 1 second, is what a theorist would call superior enforcement technology. That's what being a preferred creditor means. That creates the opportunity to lend on substantially more attractive terms than the private sector can, from the point of view of borrowing countries, and yet at rates that are substantially in excess of the multilateral institutions' borrowing costs. Expanding lending of that kind is a very powerful way of generating resources that can be allocated to finance global public goods. There is no reason why the level of such lending and the capital buffers should be as large as they currently are in these institutions. Second, there is a clear case for replenishing these institutions. One of the many global errors of the Trump administration was the decision to negotiate what was literally described as the capital increase to end all capital increases of the World Bank. In a constantly growing global economy, there is no reason why the World Bank should not have further capital increases. Indeed, you could easily make a case that the scale of the World Bank should be larger relative to the global economy than it was 35 years ago. And yet it is far, far smaller than it was. The same can be said for each of the major institutions. The United States has to make a choice. It cannot be the dragging anchor on the financing of multilateral institutions and also be a large-scale strategy center for those institutions. In my judgment, much better that the United States recognize that this is, and particularly progressive administrations in the United States, recognize that this is the most leveraged and inexpensive way to pursue its global public good, global security agenda. That each dollar allocated to international financial institutions can leverage $4 because they are multilateral institutions, and can leverage up to a factor of 10 because the institutions themselves have the capacity to borrow. And by the way, the traditional distinction between soft windows and hard windows, between concessional finance and non-concessional finance, loses much of its meaning at a time like the present, when Treasury borrowing rates are very close to zero. Third, this calls for a large-scale reinvention of these institutions along the lines that I have described, to substantially increase lending levels, to unify and expand support for private sector finance, and to move much more aggressively into the financing of global public goods. in my judgment, the opportunity here is immense. The greatest prospect for success is with the driving initiative of the major shareholder. I will have succeeded in these remarks, not if I have persuaded you that I have exactly the right agenda, though I hope I have, but if I've succeeded in convincing your listeners that these questions of institutional design of the development banking system are of truly immense importance for global security going forwards.
Thanks a lot, Larry. There's a lot of things there. Let me just raise a few issues. One is you have this large-scale reinvention of the international architecture, but how would you implement it? What the regional organizations, would they play a role too, or would you just say it would be done at only at the global level? So World Bank, IMF, UN. Would you have a web of regional things? And for regional public goods, you were mentioning that Africa should have a particular emphasis, given that it will be half of the world population. How do you see the interplay along these lines? And what's a strategic way do we have to wait for another crisis to happen to get the political will to push it through? Do you see a path forward? How to realistically implement it? Or do you see,
I think there are
coming up, and this?
I don't think we have to wait for the next crisis. I think we have a continuing crisis around the pandemic issue and a continuing crisis around climate change, and that should be sufficient. It should be sufficient impetus. Marcus, I think that I spoke primarily about the World Bank because I knew the most about the World Bank, because it would have taken a long time to talk about each of the regional institutions, and because I thought there was commonality in the themes across the different institutions. I think there's enormous scope for complementarity between different institutions in carrying out an agenda of this kind. I do think it's appropriate for the World Bank to sit at the center of a development banking system. By the way, I was surprised as I got into this to learn that the world has more than 500 development banks, and that development banks taken together account for 10% of global investment on some measure. So this is a very large scale thing, particularly if we contemplate growing development banks. I think that you raised the question of Africa. I think realistically, the capacity of Africa to generate resources which then get rechanneled in Africa is fairly limited. So in many ways, I think the need for global institutions to address Africa is greater than the need for global institutions to address Latin America or to address needs within Asia.
So the other aspect you mentioned is technological transfer. So there are two ways you can think of. You said, oh, there's a huge financial transfers, and then with these financial transfers, we can also implement the technology across the globe. The alternative is to actually boost the R&D investments in the advanced world so much that actually this new technology is cheaper to implement than the old technology. So, solar energy might be a cheaper way to produce electricity than with gas or other devices. Or do you think this will take too long, that we go the technology route only, and then it becomes the attractive mode to produce electricity across the whole globe? That's,
I'm not sure I precisely understood your
so one way to
understood your question, but let me say this. One of the larger changes in mind that I have had in the last half dozen years is that half dozen years ago, I thought that the essence of the climate change problem was getting everybody to accept higher prices of carbon, whether generated by taxes or generated by saleable permits or generated by regulation that was the equivalent of a higher price. Today, because political resistance to higher carbon prices is substantially greater than I would have guessed, because, and more importantly, because we're closer to Moore's Law on a variety of technological innovations, and because I've studied the history of technology forcing and have found that it's more effective in bringing down costs than I had previously realized. I think a much larger part of this is going to involve fundamental innovation that's going to bring energy prices down to much lower levels. The capacity for making electricity close to free and doing more with electricity is, I think, if the world succeeds, going to be more the route to success than $8 a gallon gasoline in the United States and its home heating oil equivalent is going to be the route to success. And I am guardedly optimistic that with very substantial pressures for innovation, that we will get there, and that we will get there on a path that is probably somewhat more backloaded than the path that we would have followed on carbon price increase type strategies, but that will be all right. I think in particular, the strategies that use solar power to remove carbon dioxide from the air will prove to have more efficacy than would have looked likely 10 years ago. I think we will have more success in developing battery technologies that permit more use of renewable energy by making storage less expensive than would have been looked likely a decade ago. But I don't think we have adequate levels of investment, not so much in the basic research, but in fundamental research and prototyping, so that we are trying everything and trying as much as possible.
But would you also say then, the advanced economists, they should put a lot of energy into that in making more basic research and implementing the research, but then give it away in terms of free technological transfer to other countries in order to make sure that's essentially.
I think in general that is the right route. I think that there is substantial dissemination of knowledge, even in the presence of intellectual property protection. The knowledge that something can be done all of a sudden makes it more possible for others to do it. I was very impressed. A small fact I learned many years ago has always impressed me as a metaphor for many things. Nobody had run the 4-minute mile, and the 4-minute mile was thought to possibly be impossible. And then Roger Bannister ran the 4-minute mile. And in the next year, 8 other people ran a 4-minute mile. And so I think when things are demonstrated as possibilities, they are followed. I would hesitate to make blanket kind of generalizations about intellectual property. I certainly think we in the United States have at some moments overdone it in our insistence on intellectual property protection, particularly in the pharmaceutical area. But I don't think with respect to fundamental energy technologies that the questions of the design of patent regimes are first order relative to the questions around the adequate quantity of investment initiative. And I also think that for all of the things that one can be critical of about the world's COVID response, the fact that 18 months after COVID, 1 billion jabs had been administered in India of a novel vaccine is something that is actually quite positive relative to what I think almost anybody would have found unimaginable at the time when I worked in the World Bank a generation ago. So I think that proper thinking here, economists don't have frameworks as elegant as the Harburger Triangle and the measurement of consumer surplus for thinking about technology development, but that doesn't make it less important or less than dominantly important over the longer term.
So in terms of vaccine patents, you would be open to relax them, or would you say, vaccines are as difficult to produce as jet engines, and hence it might be still, the production might be still in the inventing country, but the distribution is a challenge on its own? Or do you have a take on the vaccine?
I think the larger, my understanding is that the larger challenges in vaccines right now involve the dissemination and getting them into arms, rather than the availability of vaccine at reasonable prices. So I would not be led to devote enormous energy to the patent issues. I would rather be devoting energy to the dissemination issues.
So there's some questions coming in from Daniel Treffler and others who would like to hear your remarks about China approaches the whole public good provision. And can you see the Belt and Road Initiative, for example, also as a public good provision by investing in infrastructure in Africa and all this? Or is this very different from the public good you have in mind and what the US should provide or the other advanced economies should provide?
I think that given the magnitude of financial strain in the Chinese economy, that the Belt and Road Initiative may be in the 6th or 7th inning. And I think it's going to be a larger thing retrospectively than prospectively. I think the United States made a serious mistake in its approach to the AIIB. We should have found a way to join, or we should have found a way to not be caught trying to stop others from joining and then failing. And I think the United States has a very broad challenge in figuring out a strategy where it is not a unilateral hegemon of its section of the world as before 1989, or a kind of unilateral hegemon as after 1989. And I think we in the United States have a bit of a tendency to conflate a strategy with a wish list. Our strategy towards a country or towards a region or towards a problem consists of a list of all the things we want. And often our desires are entirely legitimate and rational. But a strategy has three elements. It has a list of desiderata. It has a list and attempt to articulate what leverage one has to get others to join with respect to those desiderata. And it considers what issues one's prepared to make sacrifices on and to accommodate the preferences of others in order that others will accommodate one's own preferences. And those second two elements tend to be a bit absent in US strategy. I think for the most part, the issues around Belt and Road and the construction of infrastructure are somewhat different than the issues around the provision of global public goods, especially when a substantial share of Chinese Belt and Road investment has been motivated by various kinds of Chinese commercial and national security concern. I would not put that in a global public goods basket for the most part. I think there has been an opportunity for the United States and for the West in our much greater success in producing effective vaccines than the Chinese have had so far. And I'm not sure we have maximized that opportunity in the way that we have handled things. I think we have appeared more grudging and slow than we have in fact been, and that that we need to find ways to act in more of a spirit of broad generosity. On the other hand, Marcus, I sympathize with American policymakers because there is often, and this is painful to say, but it is true, there is often a choice between operating effectively and efficiently and operating through the internationally legitimate UN system, which has the virtues of high multilateralism, but does not have the virtue often of operational effectiveness to the extent that would be desired. This complicated mix of considerations is what has led me, in conjunction with Tarman and Ngozi and our colleagues on the high-level panel, to put emphasis on G20 plus as an approach to addressing global health issues.
So let me make it concrete. Would you have given the vaccine technology of mRNA away to the Chinese, for example, as a gesture, or that's too radical?
I would have been prepared to engage in licensing type arrangements. I wouldn't have given it, I would not have given it away completely.
Okay. So you also mentioned, that the World Bank has some superior enforcement technology to get the loans back, and hence you can charge a low interest rate. And of course, it's very difficult to put more capital in the World Bank, politically difficult. But is there other ways to leverage the enforcement technology that you essentially say to the private sector, you lend, but I will enforce it for you? Can you imagine some other creative solutions this way to essentially get more the funding from the private sector channeled into the emerging economies, and then the enforcement is somehow done by the institutions with better enforcement technology?
I think there are, by the way, for every dollar the U.S. Congress appropriates to the hard window of the World Bank, it's not implausible to suppose that $40 or $50 could be lent out. So it is, and at today's interest rates, that's essentially at what we would once have regarded as being concessional terms. And so there is immense power in that financial model. And I'm not sure why one should take as a constraint that capital cannot be increased. I think we need to look on a continuing basis at various kinds of co-financing arrangements. Larry Fink has suggested that the Bretton Woods institutions take first losses so as to support and catalyze private sector lending in the sustainability sphere. I think that you need to decide how much you want the international financial institutions to be taking first losses and how much you want them to be able to lever capital. But you can't get high rates of leverage while also taking first losses. And I'm inclined to think that the first loss idea is not the right way to go in most circumstances. I think there should be more attention. I've long thought that there should be more attention devoted to co-financing arrangements in which others are permitted to lend on a pari passu basis with the World Bank. Of course, those arrangements don't have what was a principal virtue I was citing of the enforcement technology. If a country has a 4%, if with the World Bank's enforcement technology, you can lend profitably to a country at 1% that can borrow from the market at 4%, and then the actual lending takes place at 2.5% or 3%. We would prefer for the profits, the 1.5% spread, to go to good global causes, not to the shareholders of investment banks. And so simply co-financing is great for the sharedholders of investment banks, but has an element of corporate welfare. Co-financing with a fee is a device that could work. But I would like to see much more financial engineering talent go into these various questions.
And where would this would come from, academia, or it would come from Wall Street, this financial engineering?
I think there is scope for both. I might even dare to suggest that the Bentheim Center has some history of bringing together Wall Street and academic expertise.
Very good. So we will try to pursue this worthy goal. So in general, if you think about global goods, do you view as financial stability also as a global good, or do you think that's, would go beyond the World Bank, and that's much more the IMF business? And pushing a little bit, do you see, if we go look at the sovereign debt situation, do you see some troubles ahead, and do you see a way to deal with this in a new framework, with a new common framework, or do you have any, if I push global goods in a much broader sense? Because it might also cause.
So I think there are two separate questions. I have a 25-year history going back to my time at the U.S. Treasury of thinking that there should be a more satisfactory set of arrangements around emerging market financial stability. And at various points, it's been my view that particular functions should be anchored that have more to do with macro stability more explicitly towards the IMF. And when I was at the Treasury, and I found the same thing at the Treasury and that I found at Harvard, when there were two units that seemed like they were doing similar things that someone thought should cooperate more extensively, they didn't want to be made into one unit for all sorts of reasons. And so it was suggesting that there'd be a coordinating committee between the two of them, and then all would be fine. And they went about their business more or less as they had before. And that's been my general observation. So I think with respect to financial stability over time, a larger fraction of that concern should move toward the fund. I think that a larger fraction of long-term development issues should probably be moving towards the bank. I don't think the world's debt architecture is in terribly good shape. I have been watching this stuff for a long time, and I've never seen a debt restructuring that took place too early. And I've seen a lot of debt restructurings that took place too late at substantial cost to everybody involved. I think the emergence of China as a large creditor and its non-participation as a regular member of the Paris Club creates additional challenges. I think there are now a class of hybrid creditors somewhere between official and private that create difficulties. I think it is hard to judge. I think it's fair to say, looking back to the summer of 2020, that there was very substantial alarm about the debt restructuring architecture, that not much that was fundamental was done to the debt restructuring architecture, and that it's all kind of been okay so far. I think the question is always, when a problem doesn't come, does that mean that it was exaggerated in the first place, or that it's around the corner? And I guess the combination of Omicron and the Fed off hold, the two of those factors together make me quite nervous. But my guess is that for people who want to improve outcomes in a zero interest rate world, or what's likely, I think, still to be a very low real interest rate world, I tend to be more simple. I tend to think that finding ways to generate more new money will be a better strategy than finding ways to write off old debts. That's a judgment that I could easily be driven by events to change 6 or 12 months from now, but that would be my current instinct.
Let me come back to the other favorite topic of yours, which is about inflation. But we will not go inflation, but let's suppose the Fed has to hike interest rates more dramatic, and as you wrote yesterday in the Washington Post or today, might create a little recession in the US to control inflation. What do you think are the implications for the emerging economies? that might be quite dramatic in terms of capital flows and sudden stops.
Historically, one of the reasons why it's better to be credible and better to start sooner is then you need to ultimately raise rates less, and that means less strain on emerging markets. On the other hand, I think it is important to recognize that the world is much better reserved in most places than it has been historically. You know, I'm struck by the contrast between India, when I joined the World Bank in 1990, had in the summer of 1991 a serious financial crisis for which, with great secrecy, $1 billion of collateral was moved out of India so that it could be borrowed against, so that the government could meet its needs. And at that time, the World Bank had a capacity to lend $3 billion to India. And so that was an immensely important thing. Today, India's reserves are measured in the hundreds of billions of dollars, and it itself has a $5 billion foreign aid program. And so, and the World Bank has perhaps a capacity to lend $6 or $7 billion in a year to India. And so the morals of that, I think, are two. They are that there's a degree of insulation that is different and very drastically different from the debt crisis period of the 1980s, but also that there's a lot that needs to happen if the global financial institutions are to maintain their degree of relevance.
But do you think in the long run, we should live with a global financial architecture where all emerging economies have huge reserve holdings? That's an efficient arrangement ultimately, or should we go for more swap line arrangements in order to get the reserve holdings at a more reasonable level? Or I don't know.
I think there's a question both of the total quantity of reserves, and there is a question of the form in which they are held. And I have long been of the view that figuring out how to deploy those reserves in more attractive forms is and higher returning forms should be a priority in the global financial system.
Good. So let me come back to the funding of the global good. So we make go the circle. So one challenge is often that there might be enough funding out there from the private sector, but it's always attached to a very short-term horizon. So it's not long-term enough. Why do you think is the private markets so reluctant to fund very long-term projects? And if you want to set up a health system in a country or something, it has to be a long-run sustained effort rather than just a 5-year or 10-year horizon. Do you have your favorite theory?
I look at Tesla. Tesla and the current valuation of Tesla stands for me as a pretty vivid indictment of the idea that the private sector is myopic. I look at a range of other companies that have very large profit, very large valuations, and cash flows to shareholders are not envisioned for a long time to come. So I am rather skeptical of the idea of private sector myopia as a systematic problem. And I'm rather skeptical also of the capacity of governments to be non-myopic in the things they do. So the framing of problems in terms of a market failure around myopia seems to me to be fundamentally a bad one. And I would rather put emphasis on externality type benefits or property rights type issues. But whenever I hear somebody talking about private sector myopia, I tend to reach for my wallet, because I think that this is someone, my observation is that CEOs in whom the market has little confidence and whose stocks trade as a consequence at low multiples tend to be the biggest advocates for the myopia thesis. And I tend to think that it's got less to do with myopia than a market judgment. Marcus, if myopia were a systematic problem, one would tend to think that you would get paid for being willing to invest in really long horizon things. And I think the weight of financial evidence over very long periods of time, despite the recent difficulties that value has had as a factor, is exactly the opposite, that you get disproportionately compensated for investing in low duration companies rather than high duration companies.
So going back to Tesla, just to conclude, essentially, Tesla essentially led a transformation of the whole car industry, dramatically sped everything up by 10 years or so towards electric cars. If we go for more generally for the climate change aspects, do you see that the private sector will drive that, or do you think that it has to be the government enforcing it? We cannot rely on a few private players.
I think you need some of both. I'm not sure Tesla would be where it would be without incentives for electric cars. I'm pretty sure Tesla would not be where it is without a variety of innovations that were driven over time by DARPA. But I think you have to be sort of rigorous about it. My general view, Marcus, is that the best generals are the ones who hate war the most. And the best people carrying on industrial policy are the ones who are most cynical about the capacity of governments and most admiring of markets. So I think there's obviously a substantial role for fostering innovation in all these areas, but it has to be done with a lot of discipline.
Let me conclude. You said you changed your mind about pollution taxes or carbon tax more towards subsidizing new technology and basic research. Can you elaborate how you changed your mind? What made you think differently? What were the decisive insights? Because I think it's a very important debate also across the globe, which way we go in terms of the climate change debate.
So let me answer that in two ways. One is that I try very hard to be a fox rather than a hedgehog. And so the only papers that I tend not to read are papers that have as their thing that they created a very complicated model and then they reached a number that came out of the model, but there wasn't real transparency as to what was driving the calculation. And the only calculations that I ever believe are ones where somebody can give me the essence of the argument on the back of the envelope that I can follow with 15 minutes of thought. And so I'm kind of try to always be very, very flexible. What did I see? I think I saw two different things. I saw all over, I saw what was happening in France. I had a reading of US politics about carbon tax increases. I ask myself what I would think if the choice were, if I was living in a poor country and somebody was telling me I should stop using coal and not have air conditioning or turn my air conditioning off for 6 hours. So I sort of became aware that the path that I was drawn to was likely to be more difficult than I thought. And then I noticed things that the Obama CAFE standards that everybody thought in the auto industry were really going to be a huge burden on the economy turned out to be much less burdensome than people had expected them to be. That I encountered an article somewhere that said that even though it had been done with command and control, the stuff that was done to stop the Los Angeles smog in the 1950s had worked out much more cheaply than people expected. And I started to look more systematically at a variety of examples. And it did seem that there was this very large difference, that when the government says that it's going to do an infrastructure project, big infrastructure project, or buy a big weapon system, it always costs much more than the initial estimates. But the classic example being sulfur oxide, in the environmental area, it tended to be much less. And I tried to think as an economist about why that would be true. And I very quickly realized that the answer was that the sources of information were biased low in the case of infrastructure projects. They were the people who were going to do the infrastructure project and wanted the contract. And the sources of information in the environmental area were the people who were going to be regulated, and they wanted to not do this stuff. And that came to me as a kind of natural regularity. And those two things together changed my orientation. But I think that's the answer at one level. I think the answer at another level is that I kind of always ask myself, with respect to the things I believe, what are the best arguments that I'm wrong? And do I or do I not find them convincing? And if I start to find them convincing, to not be governed by inertia.
So, but in terms of how much should the government specify, this principle of technology neutrality, you would still go with that in a sense? Should we all go for electric cars or fuel cell cars? Would you say the government should help to coordinate the industry in one direction, or should stay technologically neutral?
I don't think that question can be given an absolute answer of principle, Marcus. My guess is that the right lesson is kind of open systems over closed systems, and don't try to prohibit too early, and be aware that the world's going to change a lot. I mean, to take an example that seems important to me in the US debate, there's a lot of discussion about high-speed rail. It strikes me as fairly likely that a generation from now, it's going to be possible for automatic vehicles to go 100 miles an hour on highways much more densely packed than people drive today. The potential emergence of that technology with the flexibility that comes with it when people get off the highway seems to me to make high-speed rail substantially less attractive. And I think in general, creating a bias against ossification and freezing into a closed technology that's optimal at a particular moment is the bias I would bring. But clearly you don't want to have a railway system where everybody's on different gauges. And so you can't abdicate any role for standard setting for conformity.
Great. I think, I set the expectations high, but you were beating them easily, even though I set the expectations high. So even though, connecting to the biases from, you mentioned just 2 sentences ago, I think we're very happy to have your thoughts on this. And we're looking forward to another interaction on inflation in January 21st, with you and Paul Krugman. And I'm very grateful for your insights, and I hope we can keep communicating and keep the conversations going. Thanks a lot for.
Thank you very much, Markus. Good to be with you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.